In South Korea, one family sits above a business network that sells phones, builds ships, insures lives, manages credit cards, constructs skyscrapers, produces medicines, and operates hotels and resorts. That family is the Lees. Their empire, Samsung, contains 63 domestic affiliates. In 2024, the group generated 331.8 trillion won in sales, equal to roughly 13% of South Korea's nominal GDP. Sales are not the same as economic output, so Samsung does not literally create 13% of the country's GDP. But the comparison shows the scale. And the strangest part is that Lee Jae-yong, Samsung's current chairman, directly owns less than 2% of Samsung Electronics. So how does one family maintain control over a national champion mostly owned by outside investors? The answer is a maze of connected companies, carefully placed stakes, political relationships, and a controversial corporate succession. This is how South Korea built Samsung, how Samsung helped build South Korea, and how the Lee family positioned itself at the center of both. The store that survived a country's collapse. The empire began in 1938, when Lee Byung-chul opened a trading business in Daegu. Samsung did not begin with televisions or semiconductors. It traded groceries, noodles, and dried fish. Then history tore the country apart. Korea was liberated from Japanese rule, divided into North and South, and devastated by war between 1950 and 1953. Factories disappeared, infrastructure collapsed, millions were displaced. For most businesses, this was destruction. For Lee Byung-chul, it was also a chance to rebuild at national scale. Samsung moved into sugar, textiles, insurance, and trading. Sugar replaced imports. Textiles served a growing population. Insurance collected capital. Trading connected Korea to foreign markets. Samsung was placing itself inside the systems of a recovering country. But private ambition alone could not create an industrial empire. To grow that quickly, the Lee family needed something more powerful than the market. It needed the state. When government and business became one machine. In 1961, General Park Chung-hee seized power and made economic development the central mission of his government. South Korea had little capital, few natural resources, and a small domestic market. Park's solution was export-led industrialization. The government directed credit, protected selected industries, and pushed large family-controlled firms into sectors officials considered strategic. These firms became known as Chaebol. The state gave chosen companies access to loans, licenses, and foreign currency. In return, they had to meet export targets, build factories, and enter industries the country needed. Samsung became one of the system's biggest winners. It entered electronics in 1969, then expanded through heavy industry, construction, shipbuilding, and finance. Each new division made Samsung more useful to the government, and each expansion made the Lee family harder to challenge. The relationship produced extraordinary growth, but concentrated wealth and decision-making inside a few families. South Korea was becoming richer. Samsung was becoming indispensable. And an indispensable company can make bets ordinary businesses cannot survive. The bet that turned Samsung into a national engine. The most important bet came in semiconductors. In 1983, Lee Byung-chul declared that Samsung would enter advanced memory chips. American and Japanese firms dominated the industry. Samsung lacked experience, technology, and a guaranteed market. Critics saw an expensive gamble. Samsung developed a 64-kilobit DRAM chip and poured money into factories and engineers. Memory prices repeatedly collapsed, while each new generation demanded enormous investment. Samsung survived because its wider group could absorb losses until the technology caught up. Then the gamble paid off. By the 1990s, Samsung had become a global memory leader. Yet Lee Kun-hee, who inherited leadership after his father's death, believed scale was no longer enough. In 1993, He gathered executives in Frankfurt and launched Samsung's new management campaign, demanding a shift from cheap mass production toward quality, design, and global branding. Samsung stopped acting like a Korean manufacturer chasing the West. It began acting like a company that intended to dominate it. Phones, televisions, displays, and chips carried Samsung around the world. Its success symbolized South Korea's transformation into a high-tech power. But global success created a family problem. Samsung had become too large for the Lees to own outright. So instead of controlling the empire through a majority stake, they learned to control it through architecture. Control without majority ownership. Here is how the structure works. As of 2026, Lee Jae-yong owned about 22% of Samsung C&T, the most important personal stake in the family's control system. Samsung C&T owned 19.34% of Samsung Life Insurance. Samsung Life held about 8.4% of Samsung Electronics, while Samsung C&T held another 5.05%. Lee Jae-yong personally held only about 1.65%. On paper, that looks weak. In practice, it creates a chain. Lee influences Samsung C&T. Samsung C&T sits above Samsung Life. Samsung Life and Samsung C&T are major friendly shareholders in Samsung Electronics. Other family members, affiliated foundations, and Samsung companies add more aligned votes. Family control does not require owning 51% of every company. It requires control over the companies that control the companies below them. The system turns a small personal stake into influence over a much larger empire. But these chains have one weakness. When leadership passes to a new generation, the structure must be rearranged without breaking. And that is where Samsung's most explosive scandal began. The merger that made succession possible. In 2014, Lee Kun-hee suffered a heart attack and disappeared from public life. His son became Samsung's de facto leader, but his grip on the group was incomplete. The key move came in 2015. Chaebol Industries, where Lee Jae-yong was the largest shareholder, proposed an $8 billion merger with Samsung C&T. They owned valuable stakes across the group, but critics argued the terms undervalued it. The hedge fund Elliott opposed the deal, arguing it benefited the Lee family while hurting ordinary shareholders. The vote was extremely close. The merger needed support from 2/3 of represented shares. It passed with 69.53%. South Korea's National Pension Service, then Samsung C&T's largest shareholder, supported the deal and became the decisive swing vote. That decision later became part of a national political scandal. Prosecutors argued that Lee Jae-yong provided bribes connected to former President Park Geun-hye and her confidant while seeking government support for the succession process. Lee was convicted in the bribery case, imprisoned, released on parole, and pardoned in 2022 after officials said his leadership was needed during an economic crisis. In a separate case, prosecutors accused him of accounting fraud and stock manipulation tied to the merger. He denied wrongdoing, and the Supreme Court upheld his acquittal in 2025. Legally, the merger case ended in his favor. Structurally, the deal had already done its job. The merged Samsung C&T became the central pillar through which Lee could influence the wider group. It also showed how difficult it had become to separate Samsung, the Lee family, and the South Korean state, when a company becomes too important to punish. Lee Jae-yong was not the first Samsung leader to receive leniency. His father, Lee Kun-hee, was convicted in cases involving bribery, tax evasion, and illegal financial transactions. In 2009, the government granted him a special pardon, publicly linking the decision to South Korea's Winter Olympics campaign. The pattern created a damaging message. Samsung's leaders could be prosecuted and convicted, but the country repeatedly found reasons to bring them back. Supporters offered a practical defense. Samsung led global markets in chips, phones, and displays. If it delayed factories or lost technological ground, workers, suppliers, exports, and the stock market could suffer. Critics saw the opposite lesson. The larger Samsung became, the less accountable its controlling family appeared. That is the real meaning of too big to fail. Any government confronting Samsung must first calculate the national cost of damaging it. And the group's leverage extends far beyond electronics. The family's invisible reach. Samsung's domestic network stretches across electronics, batteries, construction, shipbuilding, insurance, securities, credit cards, asset management, biopharmaceuticals, advertising, security services, hotels and resorts. This creates an ecosystem that reinforces itself. One affiliate can construct a facility, another can insure it, another can provide digital systems, another can handle security, financing, or advertising. South Korea has rules designed to limit abusive cross-shareholding and related party dealing. But the broader structure still gives Samsung scale, information, and coordination smaller rivals cannot easily match. The country's Fair Trade Commission openly states that excessive economic concentration can undermine competition and distort the distribution of resources. It also gives the family influence without political office. When the government discusses chip subsidies, financial regulation, trade relations, or industrial policy, Samsung is not merely another company asking for favorable rules. Its decisions can affect national exports, investment, and employment. That does not mean the Lees secretly command every minister. Their power is quieter. It comes from making Samsung's success feel inseparable from South Korea's success. The cost of a Samsung-centered economy. To be fair, the empire produced real achievements. Samsung helped South Korea lead in semiconductors, displays, and consumer technology. It created skilled jobs, supply chains, and a globally recognized brand. But concentration creates fragility. When national prestige and growth depend on a few conglomerates, smaller firms struggle for capital and talent. Minority shareholders may fear boards will protect controlling families before outside investors. Political leaders may promise reform, then retreat when growth slows. This tension contributes to the Korea discount, the tendency for Korean companies to receive lower valuations than global peers. Family-controlled conglomerates and concerns about the treatment of minority shareholders are frequently cited as causes. Regulators restrict cross-shareholding, require disclosures, and challenge unfair internal transactions. Corporate governance disclosure requirements were expanded to cover all KOSPI-listed companies from 2026. Yet Samsung's network has adapted rather than disappeared. Because the Lee family's strongest asset is not a share certificate, it is the belief that the country cannot afford for Samsung to fail. The dynasty's next test. Still, no empire remains untouchable forever. Samsung has faced pressure in advanced artificial intelligence memory chips, where rival SK Hynix moved faster. In June 2026, SK Hynix even overtook Samsung Electronics as South Korea's most valuable listed company. That would have seemed almost impossible a few years earlier. It is a reminder that family control can preserve long-term strategy, but it can also slow decisions, discourage internal challenge, and turn succession into a national distraction. Lee Jae-yong now inherits Samsung's central contradiction. It must behave like a competitive public company while remaining anchored to one family. It must serve shareholders while carrying the weight of the national economy. And the government must regulate it while depending on its factories, exports, and technology. So does the Lee family control South Korea's economy? Not in the cartoonish sense of giving orders from a hidden room. Their power is more sophisticated. They control pressure points, ownership chains, investment decisions, strategic industries, and a corporate network so important that presidents, pension funds, and regulators must consider Samsung before they act. The Lees did not simply build South Korea's largest business empire. They built a system in which the country's prosperity, reputation, and industrial future became tied to their family. And that leaves South Korea with one uncomfortable question. Did the nation create Samsung to serve the economy, or did it create an economy that now has to serve Samsung? If you made it this far, leave your thoughts in comments. And subscribe Mazuma Media for more stories about the families, companies, and hidden systems that shape entire countries.